So thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm James Graham. I'm the Director of Publications here at GSAPP and one of the editors of the Avery Review, which is our monthly journal of critical essays on architecture, which you can find online, and hopefully many of you have. And so in that capacity, we're incredibly happy to be inviting this group of fellow editors to come share their recent ventures with us. So this is the third in a series of events we've been putting on here, which start from this sort of obvious idea that architecture is a fundamentally discursive field, and that media have a great deal to do with how this discourse around buildings, cities, and spatial concerns is sort of called into being. And we've been loosely grouping these events under the thematic of publicatory practices, by which we mean that it sort of frames the work of publication not as a sort of supplement or simple representation of architecture, but rather a sort of intimately engaged contributor to how we think and act within the built environment. And so many thanks to our Dean, Amal, and to Paul and Lydia in the events office, and to our fantastic AV folks who keep things running for supporting this series of events. So each of the independent architectural publications that we've invited to take part today, and they're all fairly recent, each takes a sort of particular approach to these ideas, I think, and all of these figures manifest their own hybridities in terms of their relationship to practice and to their editorial projects. And each of them, I think, has, in their own way, interrogated the relationship between architecture and writing, which I think is one of the big questions that we'll deal with today. So we've asked everyone to present a sort of brief 7 to 8 minute editorial position statement that explains their publication and their relationship to editing in general. And the hope is that we'll then move pretty quickly onto a kind of more workshop sort of conversation. These 5 publications actually have a total of 18 editors, many of whom are in the room today. And so I think the always thin line between speakers and audience will hopefully dissolve very quickly so that we move on to some good conversation. And for that part, I'll be joined by my colleagues, Caitlin Blanchfield and Alyssa Anderson from the Publications Office. So I'm going to introduce everybody by publication because in each case we've asked a sort of single individual to stand in for what I think is a much larger assembly of collaborators. And one of the real joys of editorial work is that it's not a solitary act, but rather you act as a kind of mediator between writers, fellow editors, designers, readers, institutions, readers above all. And we heard from a fantastic group of designers 2 weeks ago, kicking off the graphics project organized by Forrest Jesse. And so today we're excited to hear from a range of the word wranglers instead. So we'll hear first from Manifest, which is a journal of American architecture and urbanism, which just put out its second issue entitled Kingdom of God. It's a journal with a fantastic range of genres of writing, and always a treat to receive in the mail. Subscribe today. It was started a couple years ago by Justin Fowler, Dan Handel, and Anthony Acciavatti, who will be kicking off the proceedings today. And then secondly, we'll hear from The Real Review, which is a new journal in formation at the hands of Jack Self and Shumi Bose. We're super excited to have them here. As fellow believers in the potent genre of the review, which is always a form of open and essayistic dialogue, we're deeply excited to have Jack and Shumi with us today, and Shumi will be representing that. Oh, excellent, good. And it's also the only 2-word title in the bunch. 1-word title, so the theme of the day. So after that we'll have Project, which is a journal whose project is the dissemination of strong positions in writing and design, and also experiments widely with the formats of both text and visual presentation that it contains. It's on its 4th issue now, founded by David Markowitz, Emmett Zeifman, and Alfie Koetter, who's joining us today. Then we'll hear about Treatise, which is an exhibition and publication project organized by Jimenez Lai. Treatise takes that oldest of architectural genres and repositions it as a tool for contemporary and conceptual architecture by inviting a collection of young practices to use the series as a platform for articulating the stakes of their own work. And then last, but very much not least, the home team, which was begun by a collective of 8 students here at GSAPP, and which is now stretching out and trying some new directions as part of GSAPP's downtown incubator space, New Inc., which is an appropriate title for a place that hosts publications. My first encounter with colon is exactly the encounter that you want to have with print media, which is to say that I saw a stack of incredibly appealing objects, picked one up, and was delighted by the sophistication of the editing, design, and conceptualization of the project. So we're super delighted to have them back in this very familiar room for them, and I think Lily will be presenting what they're up to today. So I think it's fair to say that these publications and editors are all friends of the school, if not friends, period, and we're delighted to welcome them here to Where. So, Anthony, thank you.
I'm reminded, given that we have 7 to 8 minutes to talk, what my Italian grandfather told me growing up was that there are 3 types of people in this world: those who can count and those who can't. So I'm going to read so that I stay within that 7 to 8 minutes time frame that James gave to us. So first and foremost, thanks to James for inviting us to participate today. James wrote a fantastic piece for issue number 1 entitled Usonia Americanized, Gunnar Birkert's Goes Underground, which I have to say remains one of our favorite pieces with its playful exploration of a nearly kilometer-long prairie-style megastructure that is headquarters of Domino's Pizza. He also, I might add, forced us to rethink our word count limit, as his piece clocked in at just fewer than 7,500 words, when we initially thought a big piece for us was maybe 4,000 words. So the rethinking that James' piece forced upon us is a good segue, I think, to explain the genesis of Manifest, which we envision as an ideal format to experiment and explore the architecture and urbanism of the Americas. So to give you some background, we initially came together in 2009 to write a follow-up to Tafuri and Balco's epic 1979, The American City. Much like a band, we auditioned various people that we thought would make for a great fourth interlocutor, and at a certain point it became clear to us that rather than follow up the Italians' polemic tone, we were more interested in exploring the Americas and trying to circumscribe them, or rather than circumscribe the Americas. And so we saw a print journal seem like an excellent way to undertake such an adventure through an iterative process. We wanted to provide a format where those who like to read and those who like to look at images could converge. Ultimately, with generous seed grants from the Graham Foundation and now officially as a not-for-profit 501c3, we founded Manifest as an independent print journal in 2011 so as to initiate a critical conversation about the state of American architecture, its cities, and its hinterlands. We see Manifest as a means to tackle head-on what others have abandoned, while Manifest intends to question the assumption behind singular notions or constructions of the Americas. By tracing their origins and global reach, the journal also strives to define the uniqueness of American forms of city building and the distinct set of political parameters through which these forms are shaped. At a moment when the triumph of liberalism seems both assured and under perpetual threat from those who approach the urban solely in terms of productivity, we see political value in scholarship that treats America as an ongoing project whose tenets are neither sacrosanct nor worthy of being discarded. We're trying to avoid the hermetic side of the discipline, which is to say showing 1,000 plans of something for the sake of it or making the magazine about everything. Instead, we're in favor of a very wide angle on a very specific geographical designation and, for lack of a better phrase, state of mind that are the Americas. This allows us to be linked immediately to discourses in other disciplines and have conversations with political scientists, artists, filmmakers, economists, and geographers, to name just a few. Even though we're more on the literate end of the spectrum, there's still a process of experimentation and gradual modification that goes on with the journal and how each issue is framed. Even for ourselves, like the gestation from a salon-style conversation we had with a group of people on the theme of Kingdoms of God to the final issue, which is our most current issue of the magazine, to organizing a panel at the Society of Architectural Historians on immensity and bigger than big in the Americas for issue number 3, to organizing a series of para-tours where we invited artists and architects to create field guides and lead para-fictional tours of cities, landscapes, and buildings at the Chicago Architecture Biennial and in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area. We see these events and para-tours as ways to counter any claim that pre-recorded stories or storytelling in general is entirely hermetic or solipsistic, rather than conversational. In other words, we know and appreciate that the journal is ultimately a rigid print object, a kind of closed world that is in conflict with itself over the degree to which it stages debates among its pieces versus presenting a plurality of stories within a careful framework. Sometimes the pieces talk past each other in an unproductive way, but we see that as being useful in illuminating the different approaches, vocabularies, etc., which people bring to bear on a particular theme. The collective ambivalence we share towards our subject or object of regard not only shows in our editorial format, where we each write our own take on the issue, oftentimes contradicting or speaking past one another, to themes of our issues ranging from Kingdoms of God and the braiding of architecture and religion in the Americas to our next issue, inspired by John Stilgoe's essay in issue number 1 of Manifest on what he called the withering immensity of the Americas and how the Americas have and continue to undermine traditional terminology. This also carries into how we assembled an eclectic board of advisors, which include Joan Achman and Elizabeth Platter-Zyberg, along with John Stilgoe and Sanford Quinter, as well as our advisory editors, which include Jessica Bridger, Brian E. Roberts, Elizabeth Timmy, along with Enrique Ramirez and Mauricio Quiros. Beyond the dimensions of our magazine and the grid that our incredible graphic designer and in some ways fourth secret editor, Neil Donnelly, has provided, we don't really have a format. Though we certainly have some repeat offenders, like the artist design collective known as Green as Fuck, we typically receive over 150 submissions for calls for papers. While we have to pass on fantastic pieces due to thematic overlaps, we strive to put together a compelling constellation of visual profiles, architectural projects, interviews, and long-form essays. And though each of us is committed to exploring what makes the Americas compelling and quotidian, as well as quixotic and downright frustrating, we also rarely see eye to eye. Because we're committed to remaining democratic in our editorial organization, we also decide things by majority vote. So this is to say that we don't have, this is not to say we don't have swing votes and court one another to get our way, but we believe that our collective ambivalence and conflicting points of view congeal into something larger than the sum of its parts. Our commitment to the architecture and urbanism of the Americas extends to reaching a larger audience. We search out and cultivate stories that show why and how scrutiny of the built environment can lead to unexpected insights into politics, history, and even aesthetics. For us, this is maybe one of the most compelling ways that we can serve as advocates of design and to broaden the reach of our audience. Thank you.
James, to Lila, to Caitlin, and to your colleagues at GSAPP for inviting us all the way over from London. It's great to be here. So without further ado, I guess just to introduce Jack and myself, I think it's important that we're both up here and we both give our separate points of view of why we do this or why we're about to do this. We're in a very lucky position of being able to talk to you about a new project which isn't out in the world yet, but hopefully once it is, it'll be something that you can engage with. So I guess I'd start at the beginning, which is how we started working together. Jack, in his second year at university, launched a student publication, so there's a sort of parallel with Colin being a student-initiated publication called Fulcrum, which I was on the editorial board of. And one of the many things about Fulcrum that's worth telling you about is that it was a very, very simple format, 2 sides of a single sheet of paper, two columns on one side of that piece of paper. One of those columns was always written by an architectural professional, usually someone very recognisable, and the idea of Fulcrum was that the other side would be either a student or someone outside of the discipline, or someone to, let's say, balance the conversation. And that is perhaps a thread that comes right through to the Real Review. We've worked on various editorial projects together. I've been senior editor of Blueprint magazine for a while, so contributing to various other publications. Jack was reviews editor on the Architectural Review. He'll talk to you more about frustrations there, maybe. But all to say is that we have a combined, let's say, overlap as writers and editors of architectural discourse. But Jack's a practitioner and I'm not. And again, this kind of dialogue or dichotomy of our positions is really important to Real Review. And I'll hand over to Jack just after I tell you that Real Review is the flagship publication of another charitable foundation that we have in the process of establishing, called REAL, which is the Real Estate and Architecture Laboratory, which is where the real from Real Review comes from. So there's as well as wanting to maintain a dichotomy between within the discipline and outside of the discipline, there's also an underlying interest in real estate, finance, property and architecture, and that spectrum of what we talk about. And I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you. It's also an immense privilege to be here, and I wanted to thank you, everyone who was involved in getting us here. I'm in a very kind of fortunate position in some respects, talking about a publication which doesn't yet exist. So from that point of view, I really just kind of want to make a kind of ideological proposition, let's say, and I've been particularly encouraged by the recent success of Bernie Sanders in your presidential campaign to really discuss a topic which a few years ago would have been basically impossible for me to talk about, which is, let's say, historical materialism and socialism. And this might not initially appear like it has a lot to do with publications, but actually the proposition that I want to make is simply this. Friedrich Engels in The Housing Question says, first there will be a proletariat revolution, and then there will be a form of communist housing. This entire predication of the possibility of communitarian housing as the product of a violent revolution seems to me always a completely backwards way to imagine it, and also a backwards way to imagine the power of the architect as a figure. In fact, I think actually, if we imagine it from the other direction, we could say that the architect scripts space. They are responsible for the production of a certain type of everyday life. And that's really all they have dominion and control over, is the design of that every day. And therefore there's an immense power to shape social convention and social ideas through sometimes very banal and very small things. The role of writing in this is really, therefore, if you don't believe in violence and revolution, then you must also embark upon an activity of convincing and conviction. And that, for me, is what the role of the architectural publication in the, let's say, practice of architecture is, which is to put forward a very clear series of propositions about how, as architects, we can be engaged in the historical material creation of buildings. So I take, in that sense, an extremely kind of narrow line on it, and I also view it extremely pragmatically, which is, one of the reasons that we chose the review as a format of writing, which for me is maybe one of the most undervalued forms of writing today, is because unlike the op-ed, or they abolished the review in the Architectural Review magazine, they're now called think pieces, which for me really summarizes like everything that's wrong with the direction that we're going in. The review, on the other hand, is always a proposition that looks backward. It's always based in the work of someone else, and therefore it's part of an inclusivity and the production of a dialogue. And that, for me, is what makes the review such an interesting form. And perhaps we can discuss these things in more detail, but that, I think, is the position I wanted to put forward.
I mean, the one thing I would add to that and tell you about the position of Real Review is that obviously it's easier to do things digitally. Let's say the infrastructure required to have a digital presence is a lot less. We're really interested in personally, I'm really interested in valuing intellectual and material labour, and it's one of the reasons why I'm interested in producing a print publication is because the very economy, the money involved in going towards producing something, and the validity involved in, let's say, a reviewed print publication seem to be still intrinsically related. We haven't yet worked out how to value intellectual labour in the digital sphere. And also, neither of us wanted to spend time producing the daily churn of the website. So there's clear positions on, let's say, value labour. We definitely pay all of our contributors. This is really important to us. The economic structure, or let's say the financial structure of Real Review must be transparent. That's really important to us too. Again, kind of stitching through our concerns about real estate, property, architecture, and broadening the discourse. Essentially, anybody who has thought about paying rent, getting a mortgage, buying a flat, should be able to engage in a conversation about architecture and property, and those are the people we're speaking to, as well as our friends and colleagues within the discipline. And anybody paying for the publication should be able to see where their money's going. So our intention is to publish in every issue, or in some way make transparent how much it costs to make the thing, and how much our contributors are getting paid for their labour, how much our designers are getting paid to make the thing look beautiful and make it worth an object worth paying for, how much it costs to get to you in terms of post and shipping, and that's what you pay. And it's very important to us that that's really transparent. It's very important to us for our consumers or our buyers, readers, to know what they're paying for. It's very important for us to pay our contributors, because we've been on both sides of that as readers and writers. And so this was something that I just wanted to put out there that we can talk about later.
Sure.
I think we should wrap up.
Yeah, maybe just very, very rapidly to say, yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, Shumi and I are curating the British Pavilion for the Venice Biennale this year. It's the first time that I've worked as a curator, and what I realize is that a curator is not a designer, in the same way that an editor is not a writer. It's a fundamentally different type of project. And actually, the completeness of the magazine is very important for us to make a certain type of editorial statement as well, which is to say that it's not an endless stream of blog posts. It's not an endless stream of content. It's really a very precise point, right? And in that sense, you know, the reason that we treat this magazine the way we do is that we consider the magazine also to be a form of real estate, basically.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Hello, I'm Alfie. Thank you so much for having me. I should say it's a huge honor to be around all these people. Everybody sounds so smart, so I feel a little bit off. Yeah, it is. So I haven't really prepared anything in writing, so I feel like this is going to go somewhere between being a comprehensive overview of this journal, as well as sort of personal therapy session where I reveal a lot of anxiety. So I'm going to start by giving just an overview of how this all started, sort of what it is, and now some reflections on where it's at and where it could be going. Project started in 2007 when I was still in school with Jonah Rowan, Daniel Markevich, Emmett Zeifman. I should say Jonah Rowan is one of the original founding editors and is now a PhD student here at Columbia. So you guys are lucky to have him. He's cool. It started really with a series of questions we were asking ourselves of what this word means. It was something that was thrown in our direction by a number of professors, and I don't think many of us could wrap our heads around what distinguished a project with a capital P from a project with a lowercase p. It seemed to confound us, and it also seemed to be a provocation for what we were supposed to do once we were out of school. So really, it began with anxiety more than anything else. So we organized a series of talks with various people that we thought could lend themselves to having a conversation about this term, but also people that we were genuinely interested in simply talking to and familiarizing ourselves with. Leaving school, we turned this into a series of conversations that we kept having once we all moved to our various locations of practice, New York, LA, talking to people who we still felt interested in until we had accumulated enough material that we thought we should do something with it, and that became the journal project. The project is organized in 5 parts, really, a series of writings that vary from very short readings, which are observations on a single image that one can make, positions, critiques, conversations, and then works. It was very important to us that we include a section on works so that we weren't just talking about the immaterial production of architectural ideas, but also about real projects that were built that we could speak to through the lens of the idea of a project. I'm not sure if we've come to a very firm understanding of what the term means as of yet. I think it began with a sort of naive assumption that there could be a line drawn between what is a project and what is a practice, or what is building and what is architecture. And I think that sort of polar opposition has tended to lead the way for a lot of the thought that initially began this, when it's sort of fallen into various pieces, where I'm unsure if those terms mean as much anymore as I thought they did then. So 5 years out from when we started this, it's a real time of reflection. We wrote in our editorial statement for the last one that, well, we bought 4 barcodes at a time. It's sort of like you either buy them 4 at a time, 10 at a time, or a lot. So we sort of set the tone for ourselves by saying, well, how long do we really think this would last? What sort of, how much traction do we have? So we bought 4, and we're done with 4 now. So we're really at a point where we have to consider if we re-up and keep going with this. When we started it, there was a lot of questions as to why do we need another publication? There were at that time, and there still are a number of publications that come out and continue to come out. So the question was, what do we need this for? And I think more importantly for us was not the we, but why do I need this? This became more than anything else. Of course, you hope to have a certain amount of circulation and to have a certain amount of impact, but more than anything else, as editors, this was really a grounding for being able to forge our own ideas of what architecture is, its potentials of what it could be. And so in a certain way, it is completely narcissistic. And if I were to take a brutally honest look back on what we have done, I would say it's grounded very much in our own aspirations to come to some conclusions for ourselves of what we believe architecture is. Of course, we are set on giving platforms to other young architects, but I believe those platforms should be operated on in those same terms. This should be an effort for people to try and wrap their heads around what they think something means. They don't have to be right or wrong, but it is really a testing ground for people to flex their ideas. So moving forward, we'll see how this continues to evolve. I think my ideas about what the word project means have changed. Of course, when you read this, there are certain biases built in by the editorial staff that we have of what a project is. A lot of it relies on things like form. You won't see very much on issues of sustainability or political involvement. Not to say that those aren't projects, but certainly if there was any stamp of our own editorial identity, I think it would line what the works speak to in terms of what a project is. While it hasn't honed in on a single point, I think it floats around a general idea that we all have in common. So that is that, short and sweet.
I'm going to take a brief interlude and try to fix this projector really quickly. Yeah, go ahead. In just a second. Talk amongst yourselves, discuss.
Yeah, I think we should.
So thank you for having me. I'm speaking to you from an alternate timeline. In another alternate timeline, I would be here right now in this semester working on another class. But so I'll start by thanking a few people, of course, for the invitation. James, thank you very much for having me. And I also definitely have to thank Sarah Herda from the Grand Foundation, Natasha Jen from Pentagram. These are some of the people who helped us work through this project. I'm also instructed that I have to scroll through manually due to the motion images. Okay, I'll start by talking about three things, just very briefly. Number one, the technology of self. Number two, fibrous and ratio. And number three, being young. So the technology of self, it's kind of funny to be sitting in front of Jack Self to be talking about technology of self. I guess in technology of self, we can maybe, there's one way of reading the technology of self by dividing it into the community self versus the hermit self. In the community self, I guess in both cases, it's a kind of qualification of good, a kind of maybe a measure of morality. The community self probably describes a kind of person who would sacrifice or give up his or her personal interest for the greater good of the many. A kind of maybe giving up of one's own body or giving up of one's maybe personal interests to make sure that the rest of the clan or the rest of the community are doing well. On the other hand, there's maybe the hermit self. You could say it's the selfish self, or the kind of self that turns one's back on the community. A kind of selfish individual that turns one's back on the community, so that he or she could go on a deep dive of research that no one from the community would understand or appreciate. Perhaps you could think of people like Copernicus, or maybe from the final passages of Notes from the End of the World from Werner Herzog, where the penguin walks into the mountain with no apparent resource or promise of life, but simply an obsession. So that's maybe the first take. Second, I want to talk about fibrous and ratio. When we looked at people like Alberti, we were thinking, okay, well, maybe as a practitioner, there's for sure, which I think Alberti was a practitioner, there's for sure a desire to write, a desire to make sense of what he's building. So fibrous, in the sense of construction or fabrication, versus ratio, how does one go about making sense of what one's building? Is there a purposefully kind of well-governed reason for managing so? And this, I guess, required the individual to sit down and dive deep into these many hours in order to make sense of what one's building. And these kinds of ratios may or may not have anything to do with actually rational things. Finally, I want to talk about being young. Being young is kind of ridiculous because I'm kind of, I guess, maybe it's best if I just stop using, well, I guess it's too late. Okay, maybe I can speak to the blue screen. Okay, being young, I guess. I'll use this to talk about being young. Being young is kind of ridiculous in some ways because, a person who's 40 is considered, retirement age in professional athlete. A person who's maybe 25 is considered retirement age for gymnastics. A person who's 50 is a rookie in architecture somehow. And so being young is also a difficult plight because, architecture, unlike product design or graphic design, there's a kind of heavy investment. So as a graphic designer, maybe we're talking about tens, if not 20s of thousands of dollars per investment. Perhaps more, perhaps less. But architecture, time and again, especially ground up, is always in the millions, always. And when one invests in the millions, there has to be a sense of trust that cannot be gained by simple charm or simple, let's say, smart business models, but signs of age and experience. And so this is probably one of the reasons why architects can't really build young, but architects often write young. And this is maybe one of the reasons why I felt that Treatise, maybe making sense of the ratio versus fibrous, or also an invitation for a collective of individuals whom I suspect to be quite good at what they do to dive deep together. Maybe it's also important to note that the subtext for Treatise is why write alone. To dive deep alone, I think, I guess maybe to also address one of the questions I was being asked earlier, why now? Why this publication? Hasn't this been done before already? Yes, things like maybe pamphlet architecture at one point was doing something like this. But then pamphlet architecture also maybe taught me something, which is your voice is quite different when you're 30-something versus when you're 50-something versus when you're 70-something. Your voice is quite, maybe your ideas about testing things change over time, which is why as a core sample of any air, as you drill into the ice, it's probably important for any point in time to leave a document of sorts. And this idea of diving deep together versus diving deep alone, if you're a hermit, you simply experiment on one's own accord with no comparison or awareness. You might be wondering why Alanis Morissette sound really terrible. It's because she has no awareness of what anybody else sounds like. Which is why the invitation was, let's dive deep together, let's compare notes. And to be honest, this list of 14 individual offices, on the one hand, we were looking at the contemporary publication patterns. People were publishing compilations rather than albums, individual albums. And so I wanted to produce a platform that produces albums rather than compilations. Second of all, I have the maybe burden to report that the 14 wasn't all that I wish I could have included. There were more people on my list that I wish I could have. For example, people like Florian Jing. I really wish in fact, that's one of my deepest regrets that they're not here. Were Leon Brothers, and so on and so forth. Okay, well, thank you.
We have a video that you can play.
Oh, yeah. It's fine.
Why am I the only person speaking? What happened to the other 7 editors? Is it because there isn't enough room on the poster? Or here in where? How does an 8-person collective ever come to a consensus? But is consensus even productive? Why don't we argue more? Where are the debates? Do we need a manifesto? Does a manifesto ever not simplify? Do we really care enough anything to write one? How can you be so certain about anything? Shouldn't we manifest doubt? Why start an architecture publication? Why write? Indeed, why write alone? Why write as a group? Is there architecture without writing? Why write when you can talk? What do we gain by talking? Why are publications so slow? But is urgency a requirement? Does the academic essay produce enough friction? How do we introduce more friction? How does a conversation redistribute power? What common ground exists between us? Why call for submission? Who will submit? Who are invited to submit? Has it been published before? Why do the same people keep appearing? Is there a hard deadline? Shouldn't we shorten the word count? Is it possible to have an original thought? How do we disentangle authorship from the influences around us? But do we really need to claim authorship? Who's the author in a conversation? Have you ever been accused of plagiarism? Did you lie about it? When does the editing process begin? Is editing an act of destruction? Shouldn't it generate another conversation for us? Isn't transcribing such a pain? Why can't people finish a sentence? Isn't it weird to listen to your own voice? Does the publication have to be bound? Does it have to be legible? Does it need an audience? What's the value of an unreadable document? Why do we still print? Is it because we need to design an object? Can a publication be spatial? What do you call a tote bag with 2 holes in it? Why do we emphasize architecture's boundaries? Where are the hinterlands? Who doesn't prefer a vine over a log? What are we critical of? Can criticism make money? Don't we all have day jobs? But seriously, should we make a Kickstarter? Will you give us money? How much is it for the mug? How do we attach a price to the value of our work? How do we attach a price to knowledge? Is free work cheaper? What's with all the vacuous terms? Why don't we just ask more questions? And don't you want our business cards? Thank you.
That was fantastic. Can I invite our speakers into the foyer? The drawing room.
Quickly also, if you're an editor of one of these publications and you're not already standing, could you stand?
Yes, please. That's excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, there. You can fill in these front seats. I really loved the. I think these were 5 incredibly distinct presentations that I think spoke to some of the distinctness of these projects. That for all of the sort of shared belief in the potency of publication, that we have so many kind of varieties, both of focus and demeanor, and one thing that's great about editing is you really are shaping the voice. So I think this is an incredible sort of thing. I'd like to kick it to my collaborators, see if they want to start the questions.
You know, it seems like after a list of such incredible questions, we should just leave it to
Answer
Colin.
some.
Lily, can you get your note card?
Oh. But I guess one thing that came to mind for me in all of these really heterogeneous questions is actually Alfie's anecdote about the getting the ISBNs and like kind of understanding a publication in that sort of temporal frame, and maybe because I often have to deal with registering these ISBN numbers, it resonated with me particularly. But there's something about the journal or the series that implies this kind of duration, and one potentially without an end. It's not a book, it's not a collection of essays. And so I was just wondering if all of you could speak to how you saw your projects as these kind of open-ended formats, I guess.
I mean, we thought about that from the very beginning. We saw San Rocco, which had put out, they essentially had a list of all the issues they were ever going to do from the very beginning. You know, they had a beginning and an end clearly stated. And it was for us a question really of, we didn't know how long, there was never a clear answer we could reach as to how long this thing would last. It seems mostly, as I've stated it before, it was a question for us that there was a term that we were trying to wrap our heads around, and also it was simply a way for us to stay involved in discourse and conversation when we were being taken out of school and being put into various jobs that in some way or another were going to isolate us from everything that we had, you know, grown accustomed to all while in school. And so a little bit, it's like a safety blanket. And, you know, for us, I think we're reaching a point perhaps where we need it less and less. We're coming to establish a certain confidence in our own ideas, where we are not relying so heavily on the publication itself to be that thing that draws us closer to things that we're interested in. We're capable of stating our own interests for ourselves. So that's not to say that project is over in any sense, but simply that it is maturing in a way where, like, the idea of an end is more of a reality than it might have been, say, 4 years ago.
Maybe it's a good time to jump into something that hasn't started yet. Probably the financial realities of what shape how far we're able to project forward very much. I mean, Kickstarter was mentioned, and something that I didn't speak about in the presentation, which is that when we started the real foundation, we have a board of advisors, and probably if we'd needled them enough, we probably could have got enough money to put together a shoestring publication. We decided to put it on Kickstarter because it was really a question for us as to whether people were willing to hand over money for a publication at all, whether there was a demand for this. We knew we could make it in terms of our experience, in terms of the goodwill that we received from all the people that we sounded out about contributing and about it being an idea, but I really just didn't know if people were going to be prepared to hand over money to do this thing. So having established a certain amount of hunger for it, because the Kickstarter that we asked for 15 grand and we got 26, so it seems that people did want it. And then you know, really thinking about, well, how long people are going to want it for. At the moment, we have plans for a year's worth, and then we'll have to see. But I don't know, Jeff, if you want to speak a bit more about.
Yeah, I mean, the first publication that I did of my own was Fulcrum. And Fulcrum was a weekly publication that ran for 100 issues from 2011 to 2014. The logic was always to do 100 issues from the beginning. And its strapline was pursuing architecture in the third millennium. And it was very much started basically to say, if we have 100 weekly issues, and we don't feel, I mean, I really felt that architectural media at that time had become completely divorced from the questions which were important to me. And the question was really basically, as a project of 100 issues, what can we explore and what comes out of that and what begins to emerge out of that process? That's very different from this publication, which doesn't have a specific timeline to it, but on the other hand has a much clearer editorial direction in a sense, in that it's really trying to achieve, let's say, a particular framework for understanding architecture, and a particular reappreciation, I think, of the material and the, I don't mean like, you know, you often hear people saying like, yeah, materiality in architecture, right? I really mean like the historical material quality. So we're talking about typology, form, we're talking about the kind of DNA of design that carries from one generation to the next. And in a way to raise that as a subject and to also integrate it with the questions that underpin architecture. Who is it for? How is it built? How is it paid for? I mean, these are the types of things which I think have largely been dropped by mainstream media, and also in a way were maybe not such pressing questions for the generation before me, which was much more concentrated on, you know, how does it look, as opposed to necessarily like, how does it work? That would be my kind of, and I also, I mean, I saw the photograph of quite a young-looking Pier Vittorio, and you know, I studied with Pier Vittorio at the AA, and then we're doing the project together at the moment. And I think what you were discussing in this idea of the project, something that I found very powerful about his teaching, is precisely this idea that the project is simply a proposition. The project is literally the opposite of the review, in the sense that the review looks backward to create something new, and the project really looks to something which does not exist. And so in a sense, you know, I feel like the project of all of these publications is, even though it manifests itself in very different ways, is extremely clear when we're discussing.
I think during the presentation I was talking about the core sample, like the ICE core sample, that kind of helps us understand the quality of air. And I also mentioned pamphlet architecture. I really, I am a fan of the first 10 to 15 years of pamphlet architecture. You know, and the lapse of time between the first, let's say, 10, 15 issues, I think roughly was the lapse of time between the oldest member of Treatise and the youngest member of Treatise. So the people who participated in Treatise were between the years of 1984 to 1972, and so 10 to 15 years. And we decided to present all publications in one shot. And so we would finish all, I mean, at the beginning we were thinking, let's do 15 issues all in one go. But then, you know, the idea is that we won't draw it out. We won't, you know, become old by the time we finish this. Yet we will do a survey of people who are within range.
So for Colin, so all the volumes that we have published so far, they were done when we were students at Columbia. So we follow a somewhat different schedule, and we try to follow the academic calendar. But now, since we have all graduated, and so our project would inevitably evolved, we see each volume almost as its own project. So we have very different topics, very different readings, and obviously also very different designs for each issue or each volume. So for us, you know, that it would be a project on its own, and we don't know how many we would do. And I guess as long as we could stand each other.
You know, for us, we really started with a very meager budget from the Graham Foundation, and you know, they were nice. I know it sounds kind of like being ungrateful, but you know, we asked for a certain amount to try to do a first issue, and they gave us a lot less than that initially. I think because they were wary of whether or not we would really complete it, which we did. So then we were able to get more eventually. That helped us create a 501c3 to make the incorporate as a not-for-profit. But we never really had any idea of how many manifests we would do. You know, when Alfie was mentioning the ISBN, we definitely went for just one ISBN. We talked about the 1, the 4, or 100. And we also were aware of, say, San Rocco's you know, limit on theirs, but we really, because we saw ourselves as really trying to explore and be kind of modern Lewis and Clark's in terms of really trying to go out and see this area, that we really had no idea where this would end or begin. And each issue we kind of treat completely differently, and we're also very slow. I mean, between our first and second issue was 2 years, so we're really trying to get to being, you know, annual and eventually maybe semi-annual. We have very low goals, I guess, with respect to that. But that also means that we gestate a lot on these materials and really work with our authors and artists and architects, et cetera, to try to craft something that we can put out there that we really feel like any mistakes are purely our own and not theirs, and try to deliver something that we never would have expected we would be able to create with the parts we had.
I should say, you know, I don't know if this is true for everybody, but for us, we started the project with some sort of like ambition to articulate our own voices, to get other people to articulate themselves, without really considering like the practical realities of running a journal, which is why I think what you two are doing is so incredible. Like, it's very much grounded in that. But when you think about lifespan, like, I find it more and more really dictated by like the practical reality of running a publication, where you have things like ISBN numbers. And the other thing I think about is, you know, we have a 2-year subscription option on our webpage, and people have placed those, and so like we need to exist at least for 2 more years. Committed ourselves to these things because of the way that we've sort of like maybe been strategically considerate, or maybe strategically inconsiderate of these sort of practical realities of running a journal, which I think are sort of put aside in terms of saying like, well, you know, you're adding to discourse, and there's this and that. There's the weight of the value of these things as they're related to a readership, but there's also a value to these as just being practical machines that you have to come to understand.
One of the things I really like about these comments is that, especially dealing with the sort of the nitty-gritty of making these things, is that this is a group of people that these publications were really selected in a way because of their sort of interesting relationship to institutions. None of them are institutional publications, and institutions generally come with a public in some way. Like when you work for GSAPP, you sort of acquire a provisional public that GSAPP has assembled, but by beginning these things freshly, and I think this got addressed in many of these, it's really a question of public building, and that public is sometimes activated through something like a Kickstarter, which I think is an amazing way to, like, it's not just raising money, but it's framing a set of collaborators.
It's testing by
fantastic. Exactly. And then I mean, I think in each of the cases you see that. And sometimes I like very much the idea that the public that was being created with the project was in fact a sort of internal dialogue, because that's an absolutely legitimate use of publication also. It's not to simply project with certainty. I think that the questions of form said this very nicely.
There seems to be also, I mean, something that came up in, which I thought was kind of interesting across all the publications, is there's like almost 2 ways of thinking about a publication and its relationship to design and frequency. You know, one, and actually you see this replicated in architecture as well, because some design studios, for example, have extremely standardized forms of presentation. Everyone does the 1 to 10,000 site plan, which then tells you basically the type of architecture that you can do if you have to do, you know, you can't do archigram pop-up city if you're dealing with a 1 to 10,000 site plan. In a way, you can either have like a very standardized, but the advantage of it is that everyone's doing the same site plan, and you can immediately see the better or the worse design, or the more interesting or the less interesting. It creates kind of parity. You can either create a very standardized structure for publication, in which case the content is really what is foregrounded and what you're presenting. The publication in a way recedes. Or you can actually treat, as you were saying, the publication itself as a form of design project, in which the framework for how you're presenting, you know, the richness of the content, and that as experimentation becomes really what it is you're presenting. And I think frequency has a lot to do with that as well, because the kind of practicalities of producing, you know, Fulcrum was weekly. It's a colossal effort to produce a weekly magazine. But it has a huge advantage, which is if you get it wrong, it doesn't matter, because next week there's another one along the line. You know,
it's super simple, you know, having 2 columns with a set word format, 1 picture.
So we're bi-monthly, which is basically as realistically frequently as we could produce such a thing.
We'll see.
Yeah.
I actually have a question for you about Fulcrum. So how did you decide on this 100 issue format? And also, how did you work with either the interviewers or the writers? Did you have a call for submission, or it's motivated by the editorial?
Yeah. Basically, we decided that we would be real dictators about this, which is that. But the logic. I mean, there were a couple of, let's say, very important pieces of logic in that project. One was the idea of really creating a democratic standing between, on the one hand, someone was very famous, On the other hand, someone who is not famous and maybe never been published before, because at the end it is, first of all, it presents a pluralism of ideas, which is very important, which says that there is no right idea about any subject. There are always many perspectives. And the other is to say that, actually you might find that, Norman Foster and a student from Liverpool, the student from Liverpool is way better architect than Norman Foster. And that only becomes apparent when you can judge them in a similar form. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
We would sit down at the beginning of the semester and think about what questions we wanted answered and who we might like to talk to, and it was one of the conditions of having to release something during term time every week is that you kind of need to have a rhythm and you need to have backups and you need to have people set up. It can't be as organic or even as crafted in a way because it's so fast.
It was set up as a question and response, actually. It's probably a better way to answer your question, which is basically to say, you come up with a theme, you ask someone who you admire to write about that theme, and then you have someone else who either confirms or rejects or deals with it in some way. And that's what fulcrum means. It's a kind of pivot or point at which two things balance. And that was the idea, that there would always be this kind of tension between these two elements.
So one of the, I think, topic or issues that was sort of emerging, a little outspoken, is maybe the political structure of these types of curatorial work, right? So the word democracy actually was brought up. And not so many, you used the word dictatorship, but then even when it's a group of 3 or 4, technically that's an oligarchy, right?
Yeah.
And which means that the power is in the few, and then the leadership is the many. But I was also having a conversation with someone else about, so who gets to decide what's a good building, right? We're on the topic of Pritzker winners, and so that was the eventual, and then I guess the answer within the dinner table was people who know how to make good buildings. If people know how to make buildings, they can tell when a building is good, and this could be on several frames of views. Could it be about the way the detail, the tectonic? Could it be about its cultural influence? Could it be about its organization? Could it be the expression of structure? I mean, there are a lot of ways to determine, but without a kind of expertise, it's almost impossible to tell. And so to allow decision-making to become a democratic framework is dangerous, but on the other hand, I think pursuing a kind of oligarchy is also super dangerous. I think that's maybe the difficult line that everybody straddles.
Okay.
I wonder, because this is our event associated with the graphics project, if you guys could speak a bit more about your publications as material objects, and that one thing that unites you among all your different editorial positions and strategies and processes and publics is the fact that you all did choose to be in print. And I think that Shumi spoke a bit to that, and I loved the way that you said that part of your desire to be in print was a desire to enter into these certain economies and forms of labor. So I wonder if you guys could speak a bit about that, because I guess I'm also just super intrigued. I was sitting here thinking that another thing that might unite you is your embrace of doubt and of questioning and of conversation and of things that shift and change versus a publication as a broadcast. So I wonder how to the material decisions and design decisions that you make also speak to that desire to be together and to question together versus simply to make a statement.
I think it's very dangerous to make statements, as it were, and I don't want to come across as being someone, because as anyone who's ever done any form of creative work knows, the thing only becomes in the act of being done. You cannot know what the thing will be when you begin. If you did, that's, I don't know how the world would really manifest itself in that sense. And so there's always a nature of allowing, on the one hand, sufficient rigidity in order to allow the thing to function, with sufficient flexibility to allow it to become its own thing. And I think, kind of follow what Shumi was saying, this idea of treating a magazine as real estate is basically to say it costs X to print an issue, therefore each page has a particular value, therefore each word has a particular value. Not just in terms of what you commission, but in terms of like, you begin to make value judgments, basically, which is very good criteria. It's like, got 2 articles, can only print 1 of them. Which one's better? You know, it forces you to think about that.
Yeah, I actually really loved Anthony's line that there was the secret 4th editor who was Neil Donnelly, who is of course the designer of the magazine, because it is fascinating that once you have a productive relationship with the designer, then all of a sudden the constraints of format inflect the editing process very strongly. Like sometimes in the most like sort of granular way, but even in within the conceptual project of what works like in that type, you know, it really does something.
I mean, as you're saying this, I'm also thinking about the unspoken person, Zach Kais, right? Like I think Zach Kais' relationship with AA books. Is this something that you guys are developing?
But we don't have any relationship with Zach.
No, I meant GSAPP.
Oh, GSAPP.
Like GSAPP.
Actually, we've never worked with.
No,
you mean
I mean, like, is there
is there a Zach?
on board Zach Kais?
That's a fantastic question, actually. We have sort of purposefully evaded a sense of an identity in that way, which is not to say that I think Zach's work is actually quite varied in many ways.
Has Zach become like a thing now? Is there a Zach at GSAPP?
Yeah, there's no Zach at GSAPP. We actually very purposefully work broadly, actually.
Of course, the secret information on that is that Zach is not the Zach of Wayne Daly is the Zach. Who's the other half of.
It's just that when you're talking about this is the graphic week, when I see the office space and see the ambition of GSAPP books, I felt like this is just the American answer to a fantastic, European institution.
I won't weigh in on that.
I think part of the reason we like working with lots of people is because, you get all these different perspectives and brains and talents, and they like James said, like inflect your work.
We would, I think it would be really remiss not to mention our, really important collaborators, OKRM. OKRM are the designers who work with us on Real Review, also on the Identity for Real Foundation and for the British Pavilion. That's not to say we only work with OKRM. There are various projects that Real will do where we'll be glad to work with other designers. But OKRM particularly, just to kind of almost anecdotally tell you about how that works, is we went to them with this idea. We really feel like they understand our concerns, even though their discipline is completely different. So we went to them with this idea of publication for no money, talking to as many people as possible about real estate, property ownership, finance, and architecture. And said, like, guys, we really have no money, so how are we going to do this? And we spoke a lot about designing, let's say, a graphic system or a strategy that would reduce the amount of labor that they have to put in every issue.
We actually put a finite figure on it and then design the magazine backwards from that.
Exactly, in a sense, parametrically, to kind of, try and work out the pragmatics, but also have an ideological sense of value and of labour being really embedded into the design, even to the point where the format is designed for the lowest postage cost, because we want lots of people to read it. We don't want lots of people to be out of pocket. So everything is configured that way.
Just to answer your question, I think it's interesting to see how different journals just think about the experience of the reader, and also in relation to the type of publication that they aspire to do. So, for instance, for a more academic journal, maybe one would want an actual book so that it's easier to read, or printed in different sizes so that it goes along with different history of publications. And actually, the question of the format and what is printed is also something that we think about in every single volume. We don't necessarily want to produce an academic journal. It's not what we aspire to do, but we also want to challenge, what does it mean to print right now, and what other experiences could we create by either rotating pages randomly or having the reader flip, fold, and rotate. There are different things that we also want to challenge the reader. Why print a regular book when you could just get a PDF online?
I think there's some value to print for us that maybe ranges from the more noble to the less noble. The more noble being that, like, because it is this physical permanent object, as opposed to being something that you can post online, it forces a little bit more rigor in terms of editing, both on our end and on the end of our writers. They could, slack off and just say like, well, I'll catch a mistake and you can fix it and just update the thing online. So there's a permanence to it. Once it's printed, you can't change anything. Maybe somewhere in between this is like, once you have a print thing, which is physical, it acts as a form of advertising. We don't really expect to make much sales of our books that are in bookstores, but at the very least, it says it and people see it, and it's like a great little billboard, tiny little billboard that people get to see. And then I think the other thing is, for us, we started this because we just wanted to talk to people. There were people who we were interested in, and it is much more credible to say, can I sit down with you for my print journal, rather than, will you talk to me because I have like a blog. It just it lends a certain gravitas that encourages people to let you in their door, or to sit down and work back and forth with you through editing. It's for maybe that's like a terrible view of the whole thing, but I think it's.
I think that's a very positive thing, which is to say that print has maybe it is a nostalgic, increasingly value, but it has an authority to it.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it was only because, of course, I'm a professional journalist and writer and have been for over 12 years. It was my first job before I studied architecture. And in order to become a professional writer, I had to have platforms where I could be published. And decreasingly, do we have those, basically? And, you often see these projects where, like, the next generation of writers or the next generation of architects, right? This is precisely what you're talking about. That generation are already there. They lack the platform in order to be cohesively expressed.
Yeah, and also to speak to the idea of print, I think for us it was right off the bat this idea about the sense of occasion, of holding something in your hand. There's a sense of, like if you compare that to eating, if a plate is nicely plated with these silverware that are nice and cool, when you sit down you feel like a little bit of a different person. There's maybe maybe you want to sit upright or so, rather than sloppily wolfing down some burgers in your car. I think both are forms of consumption, but then
that's it. Yeah, I think we're used to reading so many different formats and different speeds and different times. I think that the whole printer's dead thing that happened a while back is clearly wrong. One of the publications that really inspired and encouraged us was the London Review of Books, because the New York Review of Books is equally well respected, but the LRB has a rising subscription rate within people aged, 20 to 35? Is it 25 to 35?
I think it's 25 to. It's the only literary publication that I'm aware of, certainly the only one in the UK, with a rising readership amongst young people.
And so we were really encouraged by the fact that people do want to pay money to read long-form, quality, edited pieces of writing. And so that was
We have kind of like, we're not exactly sure why this is, but one idea, the first thing to say is that people definitely want to read more long-form articles and good long-form writing. They're actually prepared to sit and give time for something that's well written. My suspicion is that that's because the long-form is basically killing the novel or killing the book. I don't know if people would sit down and read, God knows I've struggled with like 180 pages of editorial. But if you read, 10, 15 page editorials, it's a very different type of experience. And yeah, my suspicion is that the architectural manifesto as a long form book is basically slowly shifting into a different type of structure, and a lot of what was in that previously is turning into long form.
I would love to kick it out to the audience for questions. David.
So the question of print raises sort of the point James made at the beginning, which is the role of the reader. When you have a print publication, it's in your hand and it's an object. So I'm curious about the role for maybe each of you of the audience, or how you constructed that audience, but also whether after something is released and it's kind of enclosed in its physical form, does something come back in from readers, or do you see it as a broadcast?
Because we did a kind of survey looking at what was out there and felt like there was really nothing that did what we were proposing. So it was either like a really awful idea or it was a huge void that we thought we could fill. And so we did a very small print run of our first issue, 400 copies. Most of those were sold online, and we sold out in about 3 weeks. And it was amazing for us to see that we not only sold out, but where these were going to Serbia, to Australia, to Peru, to Latvia, Estonia, the UK, France, etc. And if that wasn't kind of reaffirming for us, we were also getting lots of photographs back of the actual object in different contexts, because it was almost like, Amelie, where the gnomes were. We have a kind of collection of these photographs with people's smartphones showing us this. And, we try to negotiate between, I think, value and pleasure. And so for us, we're very interested in the fetishization of these objects, the ways in which people, I think, are starting to covet again print, the fact that we have, a spot varnish on our first cover, so there's a kind of tactile dimension to it, and we get lots of just positive feedback from that as a kind of object that I think people want, and also because we think that print also holds people's attention. And so we get, it's funny, we don't hear, but we find out that people are getting invited to different places and starting up their own kind of collaborations and conversations in far-flung parts of the world because they've seen some work in our publication that really, again, for the first issue, 400, and I think we only sold probably 30 or 40 max in bookstores here in New York and in LA. So there's an interesting feedback loop that we've been able to establish, I think, with our readers that we had definitely not anticipated, just in terms of feedback like that.
I was told by somebody I worked with, they said, they thought it was so great, like how under the radar we were, because like they they're like, oh, like you're in no bookstores, and like you have no online presence, and like no one talks about you. They thought it was like a strategic thing that we were like super like thinking. And I was like, yeah, totally.
I was looking for you guys on Twitter yesterday for like 20 minutes.
You're not going to find us. But the thing is, for us, publicity is a weird thing because I think most of our energy is so committed to all the conversations and the editing that goes into the actual the issue of the publication that we see that as the project in and of itself. And once we have like these 1,000 copies which we order, which is insane, the fact that we have a readership is a bonus to us. It's not really expected or anticipated. And I could say that I know exactly who our readership is because I fill all the PayPal orders, and if you get one, that's my handwriting on it, and I Facebook every single person who orders it because I want to know who they are. And so like I know specifically that we have a lot of people who are on various teaching fellowships at different schools. It's a lot of students who I assume are the students of the people who are writing for us. And so our audience is very much niched in an academic environment, which is already small in and of itself. So when you have like an audience that you can recognize as being a niche of a niche of a niche that's very small, it's hard to commit yourself so heavily to saying like, I'm going to take advantage of this to the best of my abilities, because it is such a small amount of people that the payoff is not great enough where you can really be overly concerned with it. So it's sort of a bonus that we have people who even are reading us, which is great.
So I want to maybe address that too. I think, as you're talking, I was thinking about maybe the glamour of subculture, right? And or even the glamour of the otaku culture, right? Like you're a dork and you like comics, or but there's somehow a strange glamour to. Well, maybe I see.
No, I think you're right.
But I think in the longer run, somehow a subculture emerges here and there, and to me, what you just said was super cool, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, reading is a fundamentally spatial relationship, and I think that one thing that's interesting about print is that it forces that question in particular ways. It's funny for us, like Avery Review is the only one here that's digital first. I mean, we've sort of joked about, because we can see the analytics of like how long people spend on pages, and like sometimes they're actually there, and then sometimes it's the bot that just snips in. We've sort of wondered like if there's a way to build in like the idea that like once you click on a link, it's like, all right, you got it for 10 minutes. It's go on forever to like oblige attention, because attention is, I think, the really fascinating thing about internet reading in certain ways, and we've embraced it, but it's not without
Accessing it in different ways too. I mean, I've read Avery pieces on my phone intermittently, but on screen, you know, they've stayed there for weeks.
Yeah,
It's very different.
Thanks for being here, first of all. It's wonderful. I was wondering about this difference between the publication almost being like the motivation or the excuse to have a conversation versus a publication that maybe plays more like a documentative role or responds to something that's already happened.
Me too.
Well, for Colin, since our mode of operation is basically the conversation, for us, it is a project for a conversation, basically. So we never, so the publication is not even, something that that is the end, but it's just a means for us to have a conversation. And we always start with a reading group in which we try to tease out themes or questions that we want to ask, and then we identify different people that we could have a conversation with. So there are multiple conversations going on simultaneously, and even the editing process for us is also a humongous conversation within ourselves and also with the people that we talk to. So
I think basically I would agree with that completely, which is to say that basically what you're describing is what it means to be an editor. To edit is not to kill a publication by chopping down the text. You are there and you have the publication is an excuse to do something, right? And then it's like, well, what are we going to do? And that opportunity, that possibility to do something is then, well, we have to do something. What do we choose to do? That's editing, basically, is making a proposition. So even if you're publishing work that already exists or has been published before, or you're doing, the simple act of representation is also an act of presentation, I would say.
So maybe also on the topic of real estate and especially architecture, and just as we're talking, I was thinking about the California case study houses, because once upon a time there was this idea where people would produce a platform and select, let's say Richard Neutra and so Eames. We don't know that you're great, but we have an idea that you are, and therefore it's not exactly a documentation, but it's a platform for you to do it, right? And I think that in that case, that's a very extreme, let's say, platform where the output is architecture. Now today, I think if I had the means, I would do that. But since we don't, this is maybe the closest thing we could do.
For us, I don't think initially it was to have a conversation, and I think because for us as editors, really, the job of an editor is to really be listening and to observe, and not to talk so much, which is why it's a little bit feels even awkward here, because I'm trying to represent, the 30 or 40 people that we've published. But I think for us, it was really about trying to listen first to see if there were murmurs in a conversation that then starts to develop. But I don't even think it's so much about us being in the mix, but really trying to kind of corral people together that potentially speak across one another or that are extremely juxtaposed to one another. And I think out of that, we hope that sparks a conversation that has a life well beyond our means as editors in terms of trying to know what's going on with the publication.
That's it. I mean, I think a lot of these conversations are already happening, and our jobs as editors are perhaps to, as you say, curate, corral, kind of identify them and allow them to exist together, perhaps. I think one thing that we share in the manifest is a desire to extend the conversation outside of disciplinary silos. So we also have philosophers and poets and geographers and economists and other people who talk about and obviously live around architecture, but don't often get invited to the parties that we are at, much to our loss. But also the idea of the review, which we mentioned before, but to start on the project or premise of someone else's existing work and to expand also that conversation. It's not a content review, it's not like this is what's in the book, it's using that as a kind of platform to open the discussion.
If I can just sort of add one thing to that, particularly about the Avery review as well, and it relates to the gentleman's question about audience, which is, this process of editorial production is really the creation of a community. and that includes both the readership and also the contributors. And in the case of the Avery review, one of the issues did a review of real estates written by a woman or two women who are based in Sweden, and they got in contact with us after having read the book, and then I went to deliver a lecture in Sweden, and now I have in Stockholm, KTH, which was also kind of funny because I did a kind of socialist bit. They were like, what do you want? What do you really want? I was like, I want everyone to have low cost, high quality, affordable housing. They were like, we have that. What else? It was precisely the fact that I was able to go and do that is actually a product of an editorial decision that you guys made.
Yeah.
And that's an act of community building, basically.
Well, let's get Jake. My question is just, it's building on all of these questions, but more pointedly, I know at some point, I think at some point in the blurb for today's event, you guys were listed or described as independent. And then that's not here today. But anyway, but it relates to the institutional question that James asked. Because
I got some help with how boring our title was.
Oh, no, but I think it's an interesting change because in some ways that's an understandable descriptor, but obviously it's broken down pretty quickly and easily. So I'm curious how, and it relates, I was provoked by Jimenez's mentioning of the pamphlet series. And that died a slow, agonizing death, basically because of the way that PA Press had a lot of trouble institutionally, and they were able to pay less and less attention to it. I mean, I worked there. I worked on like 32 and 33, and it was tough to get resources. It's not for lack of. Anyway, point is, how do you? And then what you said about subculture is sort of. So you guys have a foundation now, So how are you thinking about? It's about the longevity question too, but how are you thinking about sort of stability versus nimble? Whatever relates to the print question. So anyway, are you institutions? Are you independent? Do those words mean anything to you as burgeoning, projects? I'm just remixing all the words that have been thrown at me. But yeah, institutions and foundation seems like a pretty pointed place to start, maybe.
Well, in some ways, we feel like we're becoming more and more of almost like a society, in the sense that we're doing these para-tours. We're going to be starting our own school very soon, and we're going to take over Taliesin first. We're becoming, we're offering these para-tours. We're actually going to probably, within the next year or two, start rolling out our own line of books as well. So we're...
You with Graham or what?
No, us as Manifest. We're now able to live off of the funds that we get from sales that we have, and then also generous, small but generous contributions as well from people who support the cause. So in many ways, we've almost seen this as, we really didn't anticipate that this would grow in that way, but it's becoming bigger than just the journal itself. So it was almost a kind of launching pad for us to start to do other things as well.
I guess that was slightly the other way around for us in that the Real Foundation we established because we want to do lots of things, exhibitions, books, and publication is one strand of that activity. Within the Real Foundation, in terms of nimbleness and agility, every project that we do should come with a degree of security in its financing, otherwise we can't do it. And we don't have a large institution, it's just for now, the two of us. Administering all the projects, not that we do all the work on all of them. One of the points of the foundation was to establish a non-profit platform that's non-partisan that allows other people to collaborate with us. So that's developers at one end of the spectrum and academics at another, let's say, and various institutions. We've been approached by the RIBA, by Building Centre, by lots of different people, and I think being an independent charitable foundation, or rather not-for-profit foundation, makes us approachable in that sense.
We operate under a 501c3, which we absolutely need, just in terms of like the practicalities of asking for donations that are able to be written off, and also for applying for grants. And despite the fact that I described us as being super underground, our nonprofit has like an evil corporate name, which is Consolidated Urbanism. So we like the play of those two things, that we can be underground, but we recognize that there's a reality where you need to form your own institution a little bit in order to survive.
So 32 and 33, that's
I think it was 32 and 33.
Coupling and unfathomable, or
No, it was the Callejas one,
Yeah.
and the following one
Periculper.
yeah, but I didn't finish that one. I left before they finished it.
I mean, so two events that happened, let's say between 2007 and 2008 that I found to be very significant were the exhibition here in New York in Art Space, Matters of Sensation, which was curated by Marcelo Spina and Georgina Hillich of Patterns. So they did this show where they invited, people from, not just, I guess pretty much people who graduated from Columbia, from the Paperless Studio. So Mark Gage was there, who else was there? Hernandez Alonso was there. So Jason Payne was there. So people who you would associate with these kinds of fluid forms were all in that show. And 2 years before that, Florencia Pita and Mark Gage actually co-curated log issue number 17, called Superficiality. And I think in both cases, it galvanized the kind of, let's say, culturally average. But it took individuals to produce a culturally average. And so when you look at SciArc now, I mean, I have nothing but deep respect for it because the cultural average is actually really high of SciArc. And so as an institution, I think SciArc almost kind of relied on these two events in order for it to be where it is now.
When we got the email about this lecture, I had a really sour reaction to the word independent. In a good way, it started a conversation for us.
People did.
That's cool because I felt, and I still feel that one of the sort of underlying foundations of Colin is dependence. We depend on each other. We started the project because we felt like we could depend on each other to figure things out. And now, after being sort of thrown into that condition, we were thrown back out and sort of have to depend on each other because we all graduated, and now we're sort of like, as a group, like $500,000 in debt, and we have to figure out what to do with ourselves. And so we do this all in our free time. We don't have that kind of funding. We do this as a project of love.
What's up with New Ink?
We paid
what is it,
I have no idea.
$150,000
I'm working totally ignorant of how that
times
works.
8 to get a cheap desk with like the lasting legacy. And I think it also touches back. I wanted to mention on Jimenez where you brought up that kind of idea of like these being little oligarchies. We're big enough as a group that we might actually have a demos, and like we have, and also the kind of the hidden people in this all. Like we don't have anyone that does our graphic design. We do the graphic design. We kind of consider ourselves also co-authors in the process. Like we don't take submissions. Everything that we publish, we've been a part of a conversation that then continues to go back and forth. And then in the 8 of us, we've each done it people that have, like everyone's been the graphic designer on a random night. Like anyone's been the editor, everyone's written the editorial statements. The presentation we showed today was actually the 8 of us writing the statement for today, which is like a large kind of how the workflow works. At GSAPP, we would be like sitting in classes, and there'd be like Google Docs, like on Google Docs happening. And like, you would see like, people yelling at each other.
It was really good to see.
Yeah, and I think that like there's a strength in it, and I think that's the only way that we could operate is having everyone do everything. We've had people from outside come and help us, which we were greatly appreciative of. But we've really found the strength in that core group and the ability to like not have your feelings hurt when like we've rolled our eyes many linear miles at each other.
But just to not skirt your question, like we pay a extremely reduced rate for one desk that we don't use, so that we can get access to like a big meeting table and free Budweiser.
Room temperature Budweiser.
Room temperature.
I would like to get, maybe we could gang up with you because we do actually have to surrender the room in a little bit. But maybe we should get 2 questions, one of which is yours, and is there somebody else who has one that they want to? Well, let's start here.
Right. Well, the title of the poster says it's quite clear that it's architecture driven, not just school. So I would ask the question about how you would compare those 2 mediums. That one is an editorial job, and the other is architecture practice. 2 as kind of let's say active instrument you would use to engage with try to do something in the world basically. And how would you compare those specific? I know there are differences, and it's quite obvious, but how would you compare compare, say, how much freedom you have, what kind of freedoms you have with each of those mediums, what kind of constraints, what kind of powers you can start to project, and what potentials you start to differentiate.
I mean, to go back to what I was challenging when I introduced this, that being that there can be a distinction between building and architecture. Like, let's just take that paradigm as an example, and we could say that both building and architecture rely on similar mediums, which are, to a certain extent, in all cases, writing, drawing, rendering, and building. Maybe more so for one and less so for another. Building more appropriate for building, writing more appropriate for architecture. I think as it relates to the practice of building a building, writing is maybe the most useless. But the aspiration is that in editing and in writing, you will somehow influence a disciplinary discourse that eventually down the line will be able to impact the practice of building. And so I think it's sort of like there are a lot of layers that you have to sift through in your ambitions when deciding how is this going to act, how is this going to impact the act of building. And though at times it might seem far away, it's not completely disconnected.
But being an editor, you are not actually, I guess it's quite a tricky relationship. So you don't really.
Well, I should say we also write. So that's the other thing for project. We're all editing, but we're also all writing for those issues. But being an editor, similarly, you're hoping that in trying to make somebody's idea that much more substantial, that it will have some sort of impact that will play out down the line, not just for an immediate readership, but 10 years from now, maybe it has some greater impact.
There are parallels and there are metaphors, and I often use, really strong metaphors between building and writing when I'm teaching, but they are separate activities. I mean, it's really perhaps very difficult to kind of try and guess at how one impacts another. There are definitely parallels in terms of working practices, and writing can well be considered an architectural practice in some ways, but it's certainly not, a direct impact on building. And I know maybe you take that one as the architect.
Well, yeah, I mean, I take inspiration from the way that artists talk about their work, right? Anyone can call themselves an artist, and everything the artist does is therefore art, which is like hugely problematic for me. But because there's a lot of, but then there's really a discussion of whether it's good or bad art, and the whole question of whether it constitutes art often gets left behind. But in a way, it's like I am an architect, and therefore everything I do is architecture. And in that sense, I completely. And I would also say with the view to editorial, I think there's two things to say. First thing is, I don't believe in singular genius in architecture. Architecture is always a collaborative process, and it's always therefore effectively an editorial process in which you generate ideas, you stimulate possibilities, and then you also do a process of selection, even if you do that through the drawing of a line, which is basically to say, if this is the line that we will do, all the other possible lines no longer exist. I think especially in architecture school, a lot of students often feel this kind of mourning when they see the final project they produce, they feel this kind of mourning for all the versions which they could never have done, unfortunately. So there's that aspect. In a sense, editorial for me is also an architectural activity in the way that you engage with the writers, in the way that you commission things, in the way that you pull it together as a project. Actually, that's all I'll say.
So when the invitations were going out, before, I made a point to call everybody on the phone. I made a point to tell them, hey, I want to do this. I'm thinking about you. Are you interested? And so once that verbal confirmation was established, I sent this kind of like a mass email welcoming everybody. And those of you who know some of the people individually could ask them yourselves. I sent them this kind of doc, Word doc. Attached to it was a concert, scene from a concert from 1966 or 67. Sex Pistols was playing. In the audience, maybe there were only 25 people in the audience. But out of the 25, and it looked really pathetic because they were like scrawny, not fashionable. Like this was before they became anything. And out of the 25 or so individuals, people who later became Joy Division were there. And people, so you could really, in fact, out of the 25 individuals, they all became fans, one way or another.
Adjacent scene.
Yeah. And so maybe to talk about the kind of freedom, I felt that, everyone that I invited were teachers, and to some extent writers, but for sure, first and foremost, they did architecture. And I was thinking, is there a way for us to produce a kind of small, but hopefully impactful? But just to maybe on top of the Joy Division, when one of them dies, they became, New Order, right? It means that there is a sense of individuality, even as a band or a group. I mean, like even in sync, like nobody paid attention to Nick, right? Like, where was their Nick?
Let's get Jesse's question, and then
a little bit sort of diving into what Dave was saying, but like it's really interesting that at no point, aside from Dave's question, did a publisher ever come up. Like I feel like in this generation, like the publishers that are big names that we see in bookshops are just maybe not important, not like interesting, or becoming less relevant, or operate on different timescales. But it's a question of kind of like distribution, maybe. So like once you have the book.
No, I think it's an
Yeah.
I think it's actually a fundamentally different question about why it is they produce printed matter, which is that when you're a publisher, it's basically like Google Analytics, right? When you're a publisher, you go out, you do market research into what people want to read, and you find out everything about it, and then you produce a book which hits that sweet spot, right? So in a way, you're doing, and this is also my fundamental issue with a lot of parametric architecture, no matter how sophisticated it is, it's always the most it can do is respond to an existing desire. The project as a concept, as a proposition, means that you, in fact, tell people what you think should be in the world. And that's just traditional publishers have a very difficult relationship with that. And I would say that basically academic publishers are the only real publishers who have the possibility also to make a proposition.
I mean, obviously in our other day jobs and jobs, I work with normal publishers, let's say, and really your point about distribution is really the only benefit. For example, producing 2 books at the moment with a well-known Swiss publisher, no names, but really they're doing fuck all other than putting their stamp on it and getting it into the shops, which I physically cannot do, and taking a huge amount of money for doing that, for the privilege, and the architects who are producing the book, which I'm talking about, are having to pay that fee because that's the infrastructure that works in terms of book distribution. That just doesn't seem to be necessary to engage with in the level and the ambitions that I think all of us are talking about right now, but it's definitely a world that exists out there which we're counter to.
But even when they do more than that, more than just distribution, it is a constraint that you might not want to work with. And that, like a publisher might come with their own editorial ambitions, their own formatting and graphic ambitions. Yeah, street cred, which you might not want.
They make you get off Twitter.
Yeah, they make you get off Twitter and all these things. But to the question of independence, you lose your independence to a certain extent. Maybe you gain distribution, but I don't think that, at least us, we're not working at a scale where that sort of distribution is all that important.
Same for us, and I mean, we've played footsie with some publishers, both university presses and more kind of, I guess, art and architecture publications, but ultimately we never got even to first base with them just because it just wasn't in our best interest to go forward with that for a lot of the reasons that were mentioned.
It might be worth insisting then that you guys are all sort of digital publications, if in the sense that the internet is your distribution.
Yeah, completely. This is the second kind of part of my question is like, once you have a thing in your hand, there you go, now what? Right. So you make an Amazon listing, PayPal things, because like we all try to do things that are, we can do ourselves because our labor is, what we can do to it, right? So the question is like thinking about that from the beginning of it, like having it be a project, like a proposition to put out there. Are there, like that seems like an interesting project maybe you've told me.
We throw parties.
Yeah.
So maybe on the topic of publication, some of my peers that were in Treatise, they asked me very practical questions, which I was happy to respond to. Is it attached to the publication because I'm on tenure track?
Yeah.
Is this peer review because I'm on tenure track? Can I submit this into my package in 2 years when I'm ready to submit my package to become a fully tenured professor? Answer is no, no, no. But another answer to, I think, to your question is maybe the value of myth. I think, you know, for Andrew and Anna, Newmark and Atwood, for example, I think they were somewhat disappointed that it was not attached to a major publication for practical reasons. But since the myth was released, I think they've begun to travel a little more. And I think there's a different kind of value in all of that.
Well, we've had people that actually cite ours as peer-reviewed, which is really funny for us. They put down as publishing a manifest as a peer-reviewed journal. So
because you're their peers and you're
exactly. I mean, it's quite a loose term, really.
I think we should wrap it up. But I've learned so much from you guys. This has been incredible for us. And thank you so much for everybody and all of these fantastic editors in the room and editors in the making in this corner as well. Plenty of great action happening in the world of publications. Thank you all.
That's great.